Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at economic development and how it's going to change in the future to be more effective. My guest is an expert in this area. Mr. Jim Damicis is the Senior Vice President of Camoin Associates. Today, Mr. Damicis is going to discuss how future economic development is in a transformational stage. Jim Damicis, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. This is a very important topic, and it's one that we're going to be discussing a lot more in the future, I'm sure. But you're a nationally known economic developer. You've been involved with a variety of different groups, and one of them is the Communities of the Future book, I guess I should say, that was written by Rick Smyer, who's been a frequent guest on our program in the past. And you've talked about ideas as to how important it is to rethink economic development in the future, to make it more transformational, I guess, come into the, how are you doing that? Where does this come into the planning process?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And you hit it on the head. It's building on work that Communities of the Future has done in the past and preparing for a world that doesn't exist. And I think that's the key lead in is that so much has been changing in the world around us and changing rapidly. That's well documented. And it's not just economic development, it's everything. And that our traditional best practices and the trends that have sort of applied in the past no longer seem to be working. It's not that they're not working at all. They're just not working at addressing the big issues, things like income growth, poverty, equality, new kinds of industries, and those kinds of things. So looking ahead and thinking about what kinds of new thinking is needed, what kind of new applications are needed, and how to do that is really important for economic development.
It certainly is. And we're going to get into specific examples in just a few minutes. But before we go too far, I want to mention your website at www.camoinassociates.com. And we'll put that up in the lower third so our viewers can go to your website and get more information. Now, we're talking about economic development. That's a pretty broad area. How do you distinguish in that broad rubric or that macro approach of economic development? Do you break it down into sub areas of economic development and all of them are transforming?
Let me address that. So when I think about economic development, including in the practice that I do with Camoin Associates, but also in the work of Communities of the Future, we're thinking of it broadly. In other words, it's economic opportunity. So it's not economic development per se, thinking about just real estate development or growing the local economy. It's about things that include everything from how people work, how businesses are formed, what are the industry kinds of trends and development going on, how does that relate to opportunities for individuals, for families, for communities, for regions, in fact, globally as well. Because again, in today's world, there isn't a community where the local economy is not connected to the global economy in some sort of supply chain or value chain. So it's very broad. In terms of transforming, I just want to be clear that it's less about how the profession, if you will, of economic development is transforming and how it needs to transform. In other words, things are changing rapidly around us, and to be more successful in building economic opportunities, we and how we practice economic development needs to transform.
Now, the Communities of the Future concept is being translated, I guess, or is being expanded, so to speak, into developing a series of other books or chapters, we'll call them that. And you're writing a chapter on the transformational power of entrepreneurial ecosystems. Which point are you driving home on that particular, in that context?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great example of what's different, right? So it's not that entrepreneurship hasn't been and still is important to economic growth, right? We know that like new ideas, creativity, innovation, those kinds of things, so that entrepreneurs can develop new ideas, create a new business, grow the economy while they're doing that. That still applies and is important. But the concept of entrepreneurship as culture, and the entrepreneurship ecosystem goes beyond that for community transformation. So what do I mean by that? What are some of the key ingredients? It's thinking about entrepreneurship just beyond just as a business development. So it's in other words, entrepreneurship should be extended to all. First of all, whether you're a wage worker, whether you're whatever sector you're in, it's a way of thinking as opposed to simply starting a business. Not that starting a business is an easy thing. So it's being inclusive and diverse, regardless of where you live, what your race is, your sex, your age. It's a process of I'm going to be entrepreneurial. I'm going to connect with other entrepreneurs, and that kind of thinking and culture is important no matter what I do. Next, it's got to be supported and integrated with policies. In other words, we as a society has always and more recently cherished entrepreneurs for taking risk. However, we need to do more to support them. So an ecosystem says what kinds of policies we can have. Boy, it's great that we rely on people to be individuals and to be gig workers and then to create new businesses. But do we have policies in place around healthcare for all, accessible healthcare, broadband, those kinds of things, education and learning built into the way we think about entrepreneurship? So it's about being more inclusive and tying that to the communities themselves, whether they be a neighborhood, a town, or a city, a village, or a nation.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you're an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a computer, you have a website, you like our shows, and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very interesting area. It's a broad area of economic development, but more specifically defined, even entrepreneurship and many other aspects. And my guest is an expert on this. Mr. Jim Damicis is the Senior Vice President of Camoin Associates. Jim, we're talking about entrepreneurship, and which is so very important. I'm thinking as we look at what's befallen the society, I mean, the whole world, really, right now, the two big issues are climate change, in my opinion, anyway, and certainly COVID-19. Is there any way we can make communities more resilient? We see that some communities have depended, for example, on one particular economic activity like coal mining. We see that area is devastated. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be out of business because the market is putting it out of business primarily, and also it's a huge carbon footprint. But can we make communities more invulnerable, I guess, less vulnerable to things such as a COVID or to climate change?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is yes. And I can tell you in my experience, I work with communities that are rural. I work with cities that are urban. I work all over the country of the U.S. And in pretty much every single case, when an economy has been overly concentrated on one aspect or one asset, it creates problems. Whether you mentioned mining, whether it's one company manufacturing community, or whether it's a tourism community. And we've seen that in COVID. For instance, I live in Portland, Maine. We're an economy that's heavily driven by tourism and entertainment. Well, that's one of the hardest hit areas right now under COVID. So diversity does matter. So think of it like, think of the economy as being biological. Biological systems they're important that they be diverse, they be connected, they nurture each other, the different agents and beings inside of that ecosystem. That's the same way of an economy. Having putting all your eggs in one basket, you're going to be vulnerable and you're not going to be resilient to shocks in the system. Those shocks can be climate change, or they can be things like COVID, or they can be things like technology as well. But in all cases, entrepreneurship helps the individual work in small organizations and small networks and become connected to other networks, therefore creating more knowledge and connections and the adaptability to change should a shock occur.
Now, what you're talking about today, we could take around the world. It's not just endemic to the United States, to Maine or to Kentucky or California, wherever it might be. But let's take a couple of specific examples. You and I had talked offline earlier about how you're doing consulting work in a state that I know a little bit about. I'm from Kentucky and born in Louisville, but you've done some work over in Bowling Green, over sort of the western central part of the state. And of course, Bowling Green is a very active center. It's one of the fastest growing communities, as Western Kentucky University, Mammoth Cave, one of the largest cave systems in the world, has the Corvette Museum. It has a vibrant, well, it was very vibrant before COVID-19. I hope it still is. But what are a couple of groups you're working with over there, and how would you apply what we're talking about at this point with them and what they're doing to really to be more effective in the future?
Yeah, Bowling Green's a great example. I'm working with the Chamber of Commerce in Bowling Green, which is a regional chamber of commerce, but they're working with an alliance of Western Kentucky coalition, if you will, everything from higher education to industry to community college, and to smaller chambers and communities. And there's an example there where they're actually performing fairly well given the circumstances under COVID, in the sense of, like, real estate development is still occurring, housing development, not just there, but nationally, has been occurring. And they're actually seeing actual new projects in manufacturing. However, they know that that's not enough. They still have long-term challenges. They have companies that and people that have not done well under COVID, that are in what we call like the high touch professions. Again, like things like entertainment, restaurants, and those kinds of things. But they also have long-term structural issues they're trying to address, getting more people into small business development, entrepreneurship, attracting people that want to live there and grow a business, for instance, in technology related fields. So what they're doing in their case is they're not taking a one-all approach. They're not saying, hey, we're good at manufacturing, so let's just keep doing a lot of that. Yes, they're doing that, but they're looking at ways of diversifying their economy, looking at what's emerging in technology, and then looking at something that's really important is who's left out. So in other words, like, what's the labor force participation? Why are some people still not, even as COVID, even as we recover through COVID, why are some people still left behind in the labor force and in the income world? And what can we be doing about that in terms of education, training, and integration into workforce? So it's looking at multiple ways of looking at their economy, as opposed to saying, hey, we're more competitive than other places with regard to manufacturing, so let's keep just simply doing what we do well and growing one thing.
That is extremely important. And I'm just curious, are they, you say it's a multi-county chamber of commerce or a regional type of chamber of commerce, and they're bringing in folks from the other counties that maybe don't have the same types of industries. They're people who certainly don't have a Western Kentucky University in every county. So they're bringing them into the planning process.
Exactly. In other words, it's limited because of COVID, but they have longer term plans to go region by region, locality by locality, and bring more people into the process. It's not a one-off plan, and that's the important thing about future planning. It's got to be adaptive and a living process, and they're doing that. And so just like any region, they have urban areas and rural areas, and they're reaching out into different parts of the regions and different in additional counties to bring people into the process. And so, yes, multiple kinds of industries, large and small organizations, urban and rural.
And that's important, not to leave anyone out. You want to bring everybody in. Everybody needs to be a stakeholder. They need to participate. When you were describing that, I was thinking back to the early 90s, 1990s, and how the area down that Mammoth cave system really was wonderful. It's one of the most remarkable natural resources in the world. And it was really becoming an open sewer. And what they did was they got together, they brought together the farmers and a variety of other folks, and they figured they had to do something fairly quickly or it was going to be destroyed. So they went to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization and joined the Man in the Biosphere program. And UNESCO came in and brought all of the players together, the Western Kentucky University, the Chamber of Commerce, the farmers, everybody. And they developed a strategy to save the cave and to make it economically viable. And it was one of the most successful stories as far as preserving that natural resource. So they know how to do it.
There's a great example too, Bill, with a community working or a region working with what they have. In other words, they didn't go out and get things and rely on attraction per se, right? They said, what do we have here and how can we make it better? Another example of that, very much like the one that you just raised, is I've worked in for Leon County and the city of Tallahassee, Florida. And they had an area in Tallahassee that was basically public works land and like retention ponds, kind of marshy, swampy, right, essentially right in this, right off the center of the city. They were able to actually put a lot of infrastructure in and upgrade that and actually turn it into an asset that was a park, a place to walk, a place for entertainment, a place for food trucks. And so they took what they had through public investment in infrastructure, turned it into an asset. Now it's supporting lots of different kinds of people, but also making it a better place to grow your business as well.
It certainly is. Now, Jim, you've been in this business for a few years and you've seen an evolution, I'm sure, of thinking and how people deal with problems, how they react, how they confront issues, especially. And I always go back to climate change because that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, it seems like. But have you seen more of a conditioning, I guess, of people becoming more receptive to looking at doing things a little more differently, transformationally speaking, and not the way, well, it worked 30 years ago, we'll do it the same way we're doing it today?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yes, and with caution too. So I think the awareness, I think both climate change and COVID. I mean, how could COVID not have woken people up in terms of like the vulnerability of our supply chains, the vulnerability of our ability to support workforce and so forth. But both of those are great examples of shocks to the system where I do believe people are saying, wow, they're more likely to wake up and say, we have a problem and we have to do something differently. Now, there are still those that feel, hey, this is just going to be a blip, a recovery is going to occur, and we're back to business as usual. So I'm not trying to say that that doesn't exist. That inertia of status quo is still very difficult to overcome. However, I do feel that people are saying, I am now aware, what can I do? And that still becomes that's where we're at today, is like building, is it getting away from, oh boy, this is going to be overwhelming, and can I take steps today to start making some of that transformation happen, thinking differently and building capacities for the next problem or the challenges that remain.
A term we're starting to hear more of, it seems like, at least I'm hearing more of it, which I hadn't heard much about in the past, is meta ecosystem. What is, briefly, a meta ecosystem, and how does what we're talking about today tie into that?
Yeah, that's a good example. That's one of the terms that Communities of the Future has coined, Rick Smyer has coined and then has used over time. But simply stated, a meta ecosystem is connected ecosystems. So we used to focus on the importance of like individual entrepreneurs. We knew that we needed to get venture capital to them. We knew that we needed to support them with training and mentorship. But the focus was on the individual entrepreneur for the most part in terms of like past practice. More recent practice and best practice is ecosystem building. So putting around further support for entrepreneurs, connecting entrepreneurs to each other, further connecting them across the community, for instance, to create an ecosystem of entrepreneurs supporting each other. However, a meta ecosystem says, okay, how can we take that's occurring and even connect it further, not just for business development, but for community development, for workforce development, for higher education. So simply a meta ecosystem is building capacities to better connect individual ecosystems so that more can get done, greater diversity, greater connectivity and sharing of information and knowledge among the different ecosystems and different individuals.
Well, the series of books that you and many of your colleagues, or several of your colleagues, are putting together will be very interesting, and they'll be out, as I understand it, later this summer. So we'll all be looking forward to that. And of course, what we're talking about today is applicable to Frankfurt, Kentucky, and Frankfurt, Germany, and Lima, Ohio, and Lima, Peru. It is transferable all around the world. But Jim, as you look over the horizon and move forward with this progressive thinking, what are some one or two of the major obstacles or challenges that you see looming?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think one of the problems is again inertia. Like, in other words, it's hard to make change. So it's not easy, whether you're talking about an individual, an organization, or a system. So the hope is, hey, maybe I don't have to change. Maybe things will just go away or pass through. In other words, the pandemic, the climate change, it will be okay. So continuing that awareness. Two, the second piece that makes it a big challenge is that is the feeling that I can't do anything about it. I see this happening. It's way beyond, it's too complex, it's too big. And what can I alone do? What can my community, my neighborhood do to impact the global economy, to impact global climate change? So both of those create a lot of fear of change, and overcoming that fear through better information, better connections, and not worrying so much about predicting the future, but a way of having dialogues about the future are all ways to start to seed that transformation.
To be prepared for the future and to set the future and to move into it in a very, very positive way. But Jim Damicis, you're absolutely correct. This is the way we're going to have to go. And COVID-19 has shown us that we will never return to the January of 2020. It's not going to be there. It's going to be a different world, and we're going to have to adjust to it and hopefully make the most of it. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.